and welcome to Cracking Culture Change. This is the podcast where you can learn from inspiring real-world stories to help you crack your culture. In this episode, I'm joined by Paul Barber, CEO of Brighton and Hove Albion Football Club. Brighton almost dropped into non-league football 26 years ago, and today they are challenging for a Champions League place and competing in the Europa League for the first time in their history. Cards on the table, I know nothing about football, but my husband is a lifelong Brighton fan. In fact, they are like the sixth member in our family in terms of time and emotional investment. And over the years, I've seen the signs of a really strong identity and culture in the club. They're now getting a lot of attention about this, and so I was really keen to unpack the mechanics behind how they've designed the culture and how they keep embedding it and how it's driving their success. Paul, thanks so much for joining me today. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So, as you know, I'm really keen to understand the mechanics of how you've gone about designing the culture at Brighton to help you be so successful. It's getting a lot of attention now. I know you've been there for over 10 years. Could you take me back to when you first joined and the conversation that sort of put culture on the table as something that needed focus?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think it's fair to say that Brighton is 122 years old as a football club. So what's happened here in the last decade is only really a fraction of the club's history. And the opportunity to reinvent the club and to give it a rebirth in terms of culture came about when we moved to the American Express Stadium, which we built in 2011, and the new owner coming into the club to both fund the stadium and to fund our adventure over the last decade. And that gave us an opportunity to determine a new vision for the club, create new values by which we wanted to achieve that vision, and then build a strategy to deliver. And that's what we've been doing and working on and still working on over the past 10 or 11 years since I joined the club.
And how, to my knowledge, it's quite unusual for a football club to establish a set of values, for example, as the foundation for the culture. How did you go about doing that?
Well, the values really are being driven by the staff. We asked the staff what kind of club they wanted to work in, what kind of culture that they wanted to exist in their daily working lives, and it was really the staff that determined what our values are, and they're not rocket science. I mean, I think it's worth making that point right from the start. Act with integrity is something I think all businesses would probably aspire to, or at least should. Aim high. We don't set limits for what we can achieve. So aiming high is pretty standard. Treat people well, exceed expectations, make it special. These are not just for us words, but the way we actually try and go about our work every day. And I think, from the point of view of the progress the club has made, anyone that's either worked with us or for us would say that we live those values. They're not just words on a wall. They are things that we try and embody in every decision that we make. Good decisions and bad decisions. So, these are things that we have to stand by, regardless of whether the situation we're facing is a positive one or a negative one, and also whether we get those decisions right or wrong. And we don't get every decision right, just because we've got a very clear vision and very strong values, it doesn't mean to say we can't and don't make mistakes.
Can I get into a bit of the detail behind that? So when you chose those values, to what degree did you kind of spell out what they mean in practice? I know lots of organisations have a set of behaviours or habits, for example, that describe what those values look like in practice, so everyone has the same interpretation. Is that what you did at the time, or did you just embark on role modelling those, if you like, and people pick them up as you go along?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think setting out exactly what those values meant. We formed the words around the sentiments the staff were expressing, and making sure that what we were hearing and what we were playing back was exactly what people meant. I think that was quite important as part of the process, and has been almost every year since. And I think living them and demonstrating them and showing that we mean them has been an even more important part of embedding them as part of the club's culture and the way we do things. And you can only do that by making sure they're well communicated, that people believe them, live them themselves. It's not just about management living those values, it's about every employee understanding them and buying into them, and then acting when people don't live those values. And, very often when we part company with staff members, it's almost invariably because there has been some kind of breach in those values. And we, as part of that exit process, would say to them, do you think you have treated people well? Or do you think you're exceeding expectations? Or, have you really bought into acting with integrity? Because in most situations, the reason for someone's departure would be because they haven't. And therefore we can use the values as a mechanism, as a process or part of the process for saying, look, this organization isn't quite right for you, you're not quite right for us. It doesn't have to be a parting that is acrimonious. It can be relatively amicable if you explain to people why they don't fit with what the organisation stands for. And by the same token, more positively, hiring people and looking for those values in the interview process, in the selection process, is also a really valuable way of embedding those values. People don't come into interviews and quote them to us specifically, but we do look for either the character traits or a level of understanding from the research that people have done into the club's culture. And if those values are not demonstrated, then probably we don't hire. And again, they get used in that sense as well.
And does that go across the whole club, sort of on and off the pitch, everyone who's involved at any level?
It has to, because if you have subcultures, the damage to the organisation is likely to occur fairly quickly. Secondly, even if there's a small subculture in one part of the club, it weakens the overall culture in the whole club. So we try and be as consistent as we can be, both with our professional athletes that we work with, but also all of the staff that support them. And the players are exposed to the values as much as the staff, so they understand what we're trying to achieve and why. And I think they appreciate and respect the culture that the club does have. And many of them actually in media interviews will talk about the very strong club culture. So we know that it does actually permeate through the playing staff as well.
Mm. And how does that go day to day? So, I know lots of organisations where they have values, they say that they recruit to values, but then when, for example, I don't know, a great salesperson comes along who's hitting the numbers, but might not actually be behaving in a way that is in tune with the culture of the organisation, the poor behaviour is tolerated and they stay because they're hitting the numbers. Have you had that kind of equivalent situation in the club where you've had to make a tough decision that actually, on or off the pitch, someone might be great in other ways, but culturally then they're not the right fit? And how do you handle that? And do you get resistance to that?
We have had that. We have had resistance to making changes when that person hasn't lived the culture. But we have a saying in the club, which is that we change the people or we change the people. And what that means is that we try and help people to understand what the culture is, what the values are, how to live them, how to make them part of the way they work within our club. And if we fail in that, or more to the point, if they fail in that, then it usually means that we do make a decision to change the people. And that means in the case of players, them leaving, going to another club on a transfer. In the case of staff members, it usually leads to a resignation or a parting of the ways in some way. And again, it goes back to what I said earlier. If you believe in your culture and you believe in the values that the club lives by, then you really can't afford for them to be weakened or diminished or diluted in any way, because otherwise the culture simply becomes diluted with it. And it's not, the good thing about the values we have is that they're not hard and fast rules. They're not words that are so narrow in their definition that people can't find their own way to be themselves and to values. But at the same time, they're guiding principles as to how we treat each other, how we behave towards each other, how we act in our business dealings, how we are as people within the community as well as within the club itself. And therefore, I think it gives people enough room and enough scope to be individuals without feeling like they're following some kind of cult or something like that. But at the same time, they are strong in their own way, in that we know when people are not living them. And I think getting that balance between allowing people to be individuals and to bring their own personality and their own way of doing things to the club, but at the same time doing it within a framework that everyone respects, I think is a really important balance.
Mm. And how do they show up externally, outside of the club, with stakeholders who you have?
Well, acting with integrity, treating people well. I think they go across all of our business dealings, whether they're with our commercial partners, whether they're with local authorities who we have to work very closely with, whether they're with local police who are important partners for us on a match day, other clubs, football authorities. I think everybody within the industry would recognise that our values are in exactly the way we operate generally. We don't shout too much about what we do or how we do it. I mean, this is quite a rare interview in terms of talking about the club's culture. We'd rather the culture spoke for itself, to be honest. But at the same time, we also understand that the last 10 or 11 years has seen the club pretty big journey and a rapid one, relatively speaking, to get to the level that we've got to in recent seasons, and that people are interested in how we've done that. So talking about it also helps to reinforce it. And one of the things that we've found in recent months is that some of our staff have really appreciated us talking more openly about it, because it also frames the way they work and how they are with their own contacts inside and outside the club. So it has its positive attributes as well.
That's lovely to hear. I can imagine that makes them feel proud to have almost the mechanics that are going on inside the club talked about. It's what you say on the inside and what people experience on the outside matches up, which is ultimately what a great culture should do. I can imagine that having a good impact. Where did you first come across the idea of culture, Paul? When did you first learn in your working life that it was important and that it does actually make a difference to performers?
Well, I've spent over 25 years now in professional football, so I've seen different cultures in different footballing organisations, which have been interesting for me, because at the end of the day, we're in a high-performance industry. We have to win. That's what our business is about, because professional sport is about winning, even though we all enjoy it and we all want it to be pure. Winning is important because that's what drives our success. But before that, I worked in a number of major public companies where culture was fascinating to me, because they were all very different. They were all values driven in their own way, but to greater or lesser extents. And I think that when you've worked in big organisations, for me, most recently before I moved into the football industry, it was with Barclays Bank. Fantastic organisation, a wonderful institution, but with a very distinct culture. My ability, even as a senior executive within the bank, to change that culture or to influence that culture was quite minimal. That could be really frustrating at times. Whereas within a football club, I've got a fraction of the number of staff, but probably just as high a profile as the bank. But I am able to influence that culture very, very directly almost every day. So from that point of view, it's much more rewarding. And I think probably a lot of small businesses, would understand that their culture and how they can influence it is much easier than, say, a major corporation like a Barclays Bank. So, this is a consistent learning for me over a period of time. Every culture, every vision, every set of values, every mission statement that I've ever read has a degree of consistency to it, but your ability to influence it and shape it is much easier in a smaller organisation than it is in one like Barclays.
How big is the club? How many employees do you have?
We have about 350 full-time employees, but up to 1,000 people work with us on a match day. And that's a big challenge, because they are part-time staff that usually only work for us once every couple of weeks. They are not as bought into the club, or potentially not as bought into the club as, say, full-time staff, but we still try and include them in the way we work, the values that we hold. We communicate with them as if they were full-time employees a lot of the time, and that also helps to sort of keep this culture secure and keep it consistent. And we make the hiring and the firing decisions, if you like, based on exactly the same culture for part-time staff as we would for full-time staff.
That's really interesting. I know in some sectors that's where they do sort of expand and contract. In hospitality, for example, that can be a real challenge, getting the strength of the culture running right the way through those temporary teams as well. So your views, how do you get them embedded in the way that they are hired and fired, if you like?
Well, a lot of it is about who we hire, and then the induction processes and the training that follows. That's it, really important. But it is really difficult. I mean, there's no getting away from the fact, if you're only engaging with people on a small number of hours per week, to try and expect them to behave exactly the same as someone who's embedded in that culture 40, 50 hours a week is obviously much more difficult. But including them on our bonus schemes, making sure that they feel part of the club's successes, making sure that they receive regular communication from line managers that are responsible for their areas, helps to make them feel part of it. And, football's a team sport, and the staff that operate around a football club, we want to operate as part of the larger team. The team behind the team is just as important as the athletes on the field, the players on the pitch. So from our point of view, we try and embed that kind of messaging into how we communicate with those staff. We try and make them feel as if they're part of the club. We include them on ticket offers and, as I said, bonus schemes and so on. So as far as we can, we make sure that culture is embedded as far as it can be, as quickly as it can be, and as regular as it can be, recognising that part-time employees by their nature are quite transient. And therefore it's a constant process. We can't afford to say, well, we've done it once, that's it, because a lot of those people will need to hear it more and time again in order for it to become part of the way they operate. But we're also lucky in that, as a provincial football club, we do have a lot of loyal part-time staff that are with us for many years, and therefore that also helps us to ensure the culture exists across the part-time workforce as well as the full-time.
Mm-hmm. And I've heard you talk passionately about succession planning, and the importance of that, again, right the way through on and off the pitch in the club. From my perspective, what I imagine that gives you, I'd love you to share a little bit about how you approach that, but it might give you the time and space almost to hold very firmly to the type of people that you recruit, as opposed to an organisation where they suddenly find a key role is vacant. The ideal cultural fit person isn't available right then, so they take someone who's sort of okay but not quite, and then it sort of degrades the culture over time, if you like. You seem to have yourself in a really proactive, strong footing around this, which means you can be more discerning in the type of people that you bring into the club. Is that fair?
Yeah, succession planning is really important for us, both on and off the pitch. I mean, on the pitch, it's the lifeblood of our business. So it's really important that we get succession planning for playing staff particularly right. And we're often trying to look 2 or 3 transfer windows ahead to try and make sure that we have the right players coming in at the right time to replace any that may be leaving us for whatever reason. So that's one side of it. But on the other side of it, we also look very closely at the top 20, 25 jobs in the organisation. We do this on a constant basis to make sure that if we have any vulnerabilities, that we've got staff who are more likely to leave sooner rather than later, or maybe coming towards retirement, or may simply be such rising stars that their profile is growing so rapidly that they become very desirable to some of our rivals, then it's really important that we know what we're going to do. So we operate a fairly simple, in my mind, system where we try and identify a successor inside the club. We always try and promote from within where we can. If there is a successor and they're ready, well, that's a positive position for us to be in if we've got any vulnerable positions or people in those top 20, 25 jobs. If we've got someone inside the club but they're not quite ready, then what it does is it highlights the development need, so the training, the development that person may need to bridge the gap between where they are and where we would need them to be to step in as a replacement. And if we don't have anyone inside the club, either right now or somewhere into the future, then it means we've got to look outside. And if we have to look outside, where are we looking? Who are we looking at? How available are they? Are they affordable? Are they attainable? If so, when would they be attainable? And again, if we can't identify someone outside the organisation, then we've got an even bigger problem, because we've got a gap inside and we've got potentially quite a big hole outside as well, in which case, is the role the right role? Have we defined it properly? If it's so hard to recruit into that role, either internally and externally, what is it about that role? Have we built it around the individual that's holding that position? In which case, that's a different kind of vulnerability, and also a blind spot for us, because we've allowed that to happen without any real foresight into what we would do if there was to be a change in that position. So it's a constant process, and the dynamics of organizations and dynamics of employment markets means that these things change all the time. Someone who might be available today might not be available tomorrow. Someone who's looking like they're secure in their job today might be more desirable to a competitor tomorrow because their circumstances have changed. So you can't afford to look at this once a year. This has to be a near constant process of evaluating your vulnerabilities on what you would do if those vulnerabilities came to pass. And it's not an exact science. There is no perfect solution to succession planning. Most of it for me is about an awareness of where your vulnerabilities would be and how you would plug the gap. And if I'm not doing that, and if the board hasn't got confidence in the chief executive to have a succession planning in place, then I'm probably not doing a really important part of my job. So again, it's a self-preservation process as much as a succession planning exercise. But the most important thing, of course, is the organisation's continued success, and you can only really have that if you have plans for different eventualities.
Mm-hmm. And do you take that same approach across the whole sort of 350 in the club? Do you focus in on key roles?
Key roles, really, the top 20, 25 roles. I mean, not to diminish any of the roles below that, because they're just as important. But like anything, the higher you are in the pyramid, the more rarefied the environment, the more rarefied the number of people that could fill that role quickly. Broader parts of the pyramid further down will have a much larger workforce that will be able to fill those roles faster. So they're not quite as vulnerable, and therefore the organisation's not quite as vulnerable, and the need to look at that level of the organisation is not so acute. But in your top 20, 25 roles, what I call the mission critical roles, the positions that literally make the organisation tick on a day-to-day basis, they're the ones I have to focus on, and I do. And an important part of, as I say, not people and culture or HR department's job. It's my job, and it's one that I have to take some high level of personal responsibility for.
And how do you? This might sound like a daft question, but for those roles, how do you get? So I'm assuming that you're thinking about, well, what if someone fell under the bus tomorrow? But you're also thinking about, what if we need someone in a year or 2 years' time? How do you get a sense of whether people will be a good cultural fit before they've been necessarily through an interview process, for example, which is, only happens closer to the event?
By getting around the industry. I mean, I think sometimes, particularly in the days, and we're talking here on Zoom or equivalent of Zoom, personal contact, getting around the industry, going to conferences, events, networking, getting to know people who are in rival organisations and understanding what they're about, who they are, what sort of person they are, gives you a picture of the market and a picture of the sort of people that immediately make an impression with you. You can't really do that if you're sitting in your office every day, talking to people on Zoom once every, couple of hours. For me, networking is still a vital tool for recruitment. And, wherever I go, whichever clubs I visit, whichever events I attend, I'm always making mental notes of people that I meet that impress me, and I think it's a really useful tool for making sure that the succession plan has got some information behind it that perhaps headhunters haven't got. Or if you go to headhunters and they say, "Oh, this person is the person that I think you should be looking at," if you've met that person and you've already got a picture in your mind, it either confirms what the headhunter's telling you, or you can say, "Well, actually, no, I know that person, or I've met that person, they're not quite right for us, and these are why," which then in turn gives the headhunter a sense of the sort of people that you would be looking for, and so the process goes on. As I say, it's not an exact science. I don't go around with a little black book, making notes on every person that I meet, but some people do, make really good first impressions, and they reinforce those first impressions when you meet them a second and third time, and you start to think, actually, this person would be a good fit for us, and if the opportunity comes up, maybe we would take them. We've actually had this very example in the past week where, you know, we've had a particular position become vacant. We were aware of someone who worked at a rival club, recently left that club. We were aware that they'd left that club, and literally they start with us on Monday. And that's a great example of where, you know, we had an identifiable need. We had a succession plan in mind. We had a person in mind to fulfill that. They were on the outside of the organisation. They were available. We could afford them. And very quickly, because we knew them and they knew us, we were able to put the process in place to bring them in. And that's actually saved us a huge amount of time. We know they're going to be a good cultural fit. We've already got a relationship with them. And that means the organisation can move forward faster and more efficiently than if we had not done that work in the first place.
Mm. It's lovely to hear you describe it in that way. It is an art, not a science, isn't it? It's and that, you know, that sense of whether someone's going to be a good fit, you can't get just looking at a CV or on a kind of job application.
No, and some people are brilliant in interviews. Some people are, you know, masters at selling themselves in an interview. It doesn't necessarily mean that the person that's being sold to you is necessarily the person they are. So the more information you can get, the more times you can meet them in different situations, the more likelihood there is that appointment is going to be successful. There are no guarantees. It's not an exact science. It is more of an art than a science. But at the same time, you know, there are steps that you can take to make it far more predictable in terms of a good outcome than not. But it does require hard work, and you've got to put the effort in to make that happen.
Yeah, and it sounds as though you really prioritise that in your role. It's not something that you just delegate out to people and culture, as you say.
No, I think it's important that it's a joint effort, and you know, I'm a great believer if you can bring in people that are better than the people that have just left you, or better than the people that you've got, it will help the organisation grow, and everybody in it will grow with it. And you know, that in itself, you know, requires a culture that accepts that you're always going to be looking for the best possible people, even if they are potentially threatening to the people already there, and that includes me. You know, my plan would be to recruit someone better than me when I decide, or the board decides, that my time here is done. And that can only be a good thing. It doesn't necessarily feel like a good thing when you think about it, you know, get someone in better than you, but actually there will be someone out there better than you, however good you are. And you just have to accept that and take that as part of the process of the organisation's continued development, and hopefully positive development.
And you said earlier, it sounds like this approach that you take will make sure that the culture is sustainable. The culture of the club will outlive you, for example, or others in leadership roles, because you're recruiting people in who are such a close fit, who share your beliefs, share your values.
Definitely, and you know, the owner of our football club, you know, he ultimately sanctions the vision. He sanctions the values and the way we deliver the vision, and he will be here, you know, for as long as he owns the club. So, you know, recruiting consistently in his sort of in his vision, in his way of doing things, is also important. But as an executive management team, we've got a responsibility to maintain that for him, and to deliver that for him. And you know, that's something which ultimately is where, you know, the buck stops with me, because that's what I'm tasked with doing. And hopefully when I do leave the football club at some point in the future, then, you know, it will be to hand over to someone that will either take that vision on to another level, you know, develop the values even further, reinforce them even more, and the organisation will continue to be successful because of that.
Can I ask you, Paul, about a bit more about the values themselves and whether they ever conflict with each other? So, for example, one of the challenges we hear a lot about at the moment in all sorts of organisations is burnout. The amount of change people are trying to drive whilst, you know, running a business, whatever sector they might be in. And looking at your own value, I was thinking, okay, exceed expectations, aim high, never give up, treat people well. How do you get the balance and help people and the teams get the balance between, yes, striving for the very best and exceeding expectations, but not at the expense of their ability to keep going day by day, you know, not burning out, again, whether it's on or off the pitch?
Yeah, I think they're important points, and you know, there's two things that we do to immediately get that balance, or try and get that balance. One is to make sure people do take their holidays, because there are so many times, and I've been guilty of it in the past many times, where you've got an allocation of holiday and you end up taking 2/3 of it and then wondering why you're tired as a new year starts, and you've got to go all over again. And in our world, the year is very easily defined by seasons. You get to the end of a season, you're tired, you then have a summer break, inverted commas, and then you come back for a new season. And if you're just as tired, the chances are, if that is an organisational tiredness, the chances are that the performance levels that you're aspiring to won't be met, or the performance levels you reached the previous season will drop. So we try and make sure everyone gets holidays. And one of the things we like to do in our culture is to give people surprise breaks. So if we get an opportunity where we have a break in our matches, and we can tag on a Friday or a Monday to a weekend, so that people get a proper 4-day break where they can, forget about email, forget about phone calls, because they know that the football calendar has just got this natural break in it, then we take it. And by surprising people, there's positives and negatives. On the one hand, people sometimes say, oh, if I'd have known this was coming, I could have planned something more than 4 days just being at home. But actually, very often we don't want them to do that. We actually want them to spend some time at home, be with the family, do some normal things without the rush and the worry of getting to work, getting home from work, sorting out the kids, getting the shopping, doing all the things that people have to do in their normal lives. Sometimes by just taking a few days extra and adding them to that person's weekend, rather than have to worry about, I've got to book a flight, I've got to book a hotel, I was going to rush away to somewhere else. No, just relax, enjoy the time that you've got. And if you can get away for the weekend and it isn't stressful to do that, well, great. But we try and make sure that the balance between sort of planned holiday and spontaneous breaks is a good one, and that keeps people fresh, and it keeps people sort of wondering whether I wonder whether that guy sits in the office in the stadium is going to give us an extra day this weekend or not. And of course, when you do, it does literally lift everyone immediately, because everyone looks forward to it, benefits from it, and then comes back the following week a little bit more energized, a little bit more motivated, and appreciating again that the culture is there. Treat people well. It's a basic fundamental value of the club. But giving them a few days holiday that they're not paid holiday, that they're not expecting, is treating people well. But it also benefits the organisation. We also provide nutritious breakfasts and lunches free of charge. And again, for young staff, where we're relying on their energy and their enthusiasm and their talent to push us, making sure that they eat properly every day is really important. Again, young people are on lower wages, cost of living is high, cost of food is very high. And it's something we can do through the chefs that we employ within the club to make sure everyone gets off to a great start with a great breakfast, and then has a good nutritious meal in the middle of the day. And for a lot of the young people, they will be the 2 meals that they rely on every day. So it saves them on their own budgets as well, which improves their standard of living, which improves the value of their salary with us. But at the same time, fuels them in a way that means we get the highest level of performance out of everybody. And that process started when we used to feed the players, the athletes, on a daily basis, breakfast and lunch. And then we thought, well, what about the rest of the non-players? They're just as important to the organisation. They're just as important to the success of the organisation. So why wouldn't we put the right fuel into them as well? And that's now become a really well liked and appreciated sort of benefit to working in the club. But it's another important way of making sure that people don't burn out.
I love that. And that's something any organisation can put into practice pretty much. They may not have your chefs, but that idea of, making sure people are taking their breaks, even making sure people are taking holiday. It's counterproductive to have people overworking, if you like.
Well, the other thing it does, Ella, is it forces people out away from their desk and into in our case, a restaurant environment where we don't have set tables for different departments. We have lots of tables and encourage people to join people they don't know. And what that does is it forces connections, it forces relationships that may not have happened because people work different parts of a big football club, and therefore it improves teamwork, which is an important part of our values as well, and obviously is fundamental to our sport. So all these things are not happening by accident. They've been part of a plan that we've worked on now for more than a decade to to constantly drive higher performance. And, going back to what I said earlier, we're in the performance business, we're in the results business. Performance is everything to us, and everybody in the organisation has a part to play. It's not just about the 11 players on the football pitch each week. It's about everybody that supports them to win matches.
And I know you were saying when we spoke before that you had tried hybrid or have been forced into a bit of remote and hybrid working in the pandemic, but have actually all come back on site for those sorts of reasons. You found that is leading to better collaboration, teamwork, sense of belonging.
Yeah, look, hybrid working can work for some organisations. I think for us, the clue's in our name. We're a club. The club is about people together, bringing people together to work in a team environment for a team-based sport. For me, is logical to have, as we did during COVID, effectively 350 different offices across the city was not conducive to great teamwork or high performance. It was disintegrative. It was difficult, and it was something that as soon as the COVID pandemic was largely over, we were very keen to get people back into the office as quickly as possible, and for the most part, the vast majority of people wanted that as well. I mean, obviously, there's always exceptions where people have got long distances to travel, or they've got complicated family situations where home working benefits them. But in our view, if it didn't benefit the organisation, and therefore it wasn't necessarily benefiting everyone in the organisation, then we wanted to discourage that as much as we could. There's a degree of flexibility for all of us. And of course, the one thing the pandemic taught us is that it's not impossible to maintain a good organisation with some people working out of the office, but it's not ideal in our industry. And therefore, we've got now 99.9% of people in the office every day, and that's a positive thing, not a negative.
It's great to hear that example, Paul. Again, every industry is different, isn't it? And as you say, it's working out what approach to working is right for the industry. We know sectors where actually working entirely remotely works brilliantly. That's great, and actually they can attract a huge pool of talent from all around the world if need be. But you're a club, you're a football club, and this is what's working for you. In your experience, Paul, sort of having worked in football for many years and also outside of football, the approach that you've taken to designing the culture and embedding and reinforcing the culture, do all of those approaches apply just as well, do you think, in any organisation, or is it in some way different in a football club?
I personally believe that cultures can be designed to work in any organisation, provided that the process that's followed makes sense for that organisation. So in our case, we were big enough but small enough to involve our staff, and obviously that process was driven by the people and culture team and by one or two external consultants that worked with them to facilitate the process that led to the values being identified. But once they are identified and once they're aligned to the vision that in our case the owner has set for the club, then it's about embedding that culture and making it come alive. And as I said before, we're not a cult. We don't walk around chanting every day, we must work in a team, we must treat each other with respect. That's not what we do. But we don't even have those words plastered all over the stadium. They're in one or two strategic places to remind people of what we're about. But the most important thing is that people just live those values, that they demonstrate them every day. But again, not in an overt way. Much of the demonstration of the values is just simply in the basic things that we do. Treating people well is pretty basic in every sense, isn't it? And what you'd expect to happen in every walk of life. But in an organisational context, where in our case, high performance is vital to our success, where pressure comes with that need for high performance and that expectation of high performance, then sometimes treating people well can be compromised because you're under such pressure that you just let that particular thing go. Well, we can't, and we don't, because that is fundamental to the way we operate. Just as aiming high, it might be easy for us, having had relative success in the last few seasons, to say, okay, we've aimed high, we've got there, that's great, now we can relax. Well, no, we can't, because if we stand still, we'll go backwards. And in professional sport, if you stand still, you very often go backwards very quickly. So for us, it's about just pushing all the time to be the best that we can be, get the best people we can, motivate them to be the best that they can be individually and collectively. And hopefully when we add all those things together, and people live those values as if they're the most natural thing in the world, which they should be and they are, then that way it's a great place to work and a successful place to work. When it goes wrong, you rely on those in a different way. If someone's struggling, if they're ill, if they're having a tough time at home, if their performance individually is suffering for whatever reason, then treating people well has a different context. And then it's about support, it's about help, it's about encouragement, it's about what can we do to get you back to that level that you were at before, because without you at that level, we're all weaker. So the values work in both ways. It's not just about reinforcing positives. Sometimes it's about supporting negatives or overcoming negatives. And as we've said many times, I've certainly said many times in public interviews, top level sport, sometimes you have to suffer the setbacks to build the organizational resilience that brings your culture to life. And sometimes that means the culture is positive in a negative situation, which I think is just as valuable as when things are going really well.
That's great. And that's what I hear when you describe it. And when I see the sort of evidence of the culture outside of the club is your zero tolerance of moving away from your values. And that applies in any organization. I think if you're going to have a really strong identity with a very distinctive culture, you can't tolerate behaviors that fall outside of that. You can't start to dilute it by recruiting the wrong kind of people or letting stuff go because times are tough. You're coming back to those values all the time by the sounds of things.
You are, and it doesn't make you angels either. You still individually make mistakes. Human beings make mistakes. They're fallible. Organizations make mistakes. They are fallible usually because of human beings or because they've got processes wrong or they've selected the wrong supplier. So, we're not unforgiving. Just because someone may step outside of our values once, It doesn't say that that's the end of the line for them. It just simply means that we have to recalibrate either individually or collectively. And that includes me. Not every decision that comes from the top of an organization, in my experience, maybe I'm unique in this, that, we make mistakes. Chief executives make mistakes. Leaders make mistakes. Leaders judge things wrongly. Leaders make judgments that are wrong fundamentally and specifically. And therefore, a strong culture means that the team around me, the executive team around me, should have the authority and the courage and the at times, the desire to say, hey, you know what, that was the wrong call. I need to tell you, you may not want to hear this, but I'm going to tell you anyway, that was the wrong call. And these are the reasons. This is the feedback. This is the impact. You need to go away and think about that. And sometimes as a leader, that's a really tough thing to have to hear. But actually, if your culture is strong enough and you genuinely, as a leader, believe in that culture, then you've got to sometimes take that medicine as well. And it's, taken it many times in the 11 years I've been in this job. Well, running an organisation of any kind, but particularly a football club, means hundreds of decisions a week. And, you can only work on a percentages basis. And I work on the basis if I can get 80, 90% of those decisions right, then I'm not doing too badly. Inevitably, I'm going to get some wrong. And understanding that and recognising that and being prepared to hear that is an important part of a leadership role, I think, in any organisation, but particularly in a football club, because if I get something wrong, we've got another game a week later. I can't afford for that mistake to be repeated. I need people to tell me that's wrong. You've made the wrong call. Just as the coach will get the same feedback from the players, and the players will get feedback from each other, and so on. And that's, again, in a high performing organisation, turning things around when you've made a bad call is absolutely critical. And I think it's the same in any industry. If you've got a leader that isn't prepared to accept a mistake or hear that they've made a mistake, then you've probably got an organisation that sooner or later is going to suffer quite significantly.
It sounds like you've got a high level of trust in the organisation for people to be straightforward, to call each other out.
Well, it goes back to what I said earlier, Ella, about hiring people better than you. I've got people in every function that are better than me at that individual function, including, my own background in marketing communications. There'll be people in those roles better than me. So therefore, why wouldn't I listen to them? Why wouldn't I listen to their judgment and their professional skills and experience, because they are better than me at what they are doing. My job is just simply to conduct that orchestra and try and get it to be the highest performing orchestra, if I look at it with that analogy. And therefore my skill set is about motivating those people and keeping them focused on what we're trying to achieve. It's not about doing their individual jobs better than them, because that's not going to be possible. So the problem is, sometimes as a leader you have to make judgments on other people's areas, and so therefore consulting them and then coming to a decision is how you make your leadership work or not. But listening to them when you've made that wrong call is just as important.
Paul, you've been really generous, thank you, in sharing the mechanics behind how you've built the culture in the club. I'm wondering if there was one tip you would leave leaders who are trying to change the culture in their own organisation, or are at the beginning and kind of wanting to deliberately design the culture in their workplace. What would your practical tip be for them to take away?
I think two things really: clear vision and consistency. The clear vision gives you the ability to then go to your employees and ask them what kind of behaviors, what kind of values that they want to have to deliver that vision. And then the consistency of following the vision and working with the values. And if you've got those two things, everything else is possible, because you can always change strategies, you can always amend plans, you can always recalibrate on targets. But if you get the vision wrong and you point in the wrong direction to start with, then turning it around can be quite difficult. And if you get the behaviors wrong in terms of how you're going to go about achieving that vision, then you'll probably end up with the wrong people, or attracting the wrong people, or keeping the wrong people. So for me, the clear vision and the consistency of the approach to how you deliver it are really vital components for any business, regardless of whether they're in professional sport or any other industry.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining me today. Thanks, Paul.
It's a pleasure, no problem at all.
What a fantastic conversation. Huge thanks to Paul for being so generous with his time and his insights. He covered so much ground there that's going to be useful for leaders. Paul's takeaways about clarity of vision and consistency of upholding the values really ring true with me. In our experience, this is what distinguishes organisations who just have the values on the walls from those who really live them in practice and who then reap the benefits, the performance benefits from their culture. This podcast has been put together by Pecan Partnership. We're experts in culture, change and performance. We've worked with hundreds of organisations across the UK and beyond to create cultures where people love to work and customers love to do business. If you need help to design and embed your culture, email podcast@pecanpartnership.co.uk or visit our website www.pecanpartnership.co.uk. Please do subscribe. Leave a review if you're listening on Apple or Spotify. If you're watching on YouTube, drop a question or a message to us in the comments section. Thank you very much for listening.